In a nationally televised hearing watched by millions, Jasmine Crockett confronts former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin over her sudden resignation, just weeks before lucrative media deals surfaced. Tension erupts in the chamber as Crockett unveils devastating evidence. Communities destabilized, key programs gutted, and a state left reeling in her absence. With emotions surging and the cameras locked in, Palin fights to defend her legacy, until one leaked memo threatens to unravel it all. The room freezes in silence. Was Palin running from a reckoning, or cashing in on the chaos she left behind? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber of the U.S. Capitol was tense, every breath in sync with the red blink of live broadcast cameras. Over 9 million Americans were tuned in, expecting reflection, not confrontation. The hearing was billed as a forum on ethical responsibility in executive leadership, but the air already smelled of something more volatile. Sarah Palin, once governor of Alaska and now a polished symbol of conservative defiance, entered like a performer returning to her stage. She smiled confidently, posed briefly for cameras, and took her seat under the seal of the United States. Committee members murmured greetings, some deferential, others wary. Her testimony was meant to be inspirational, a tale of leadership under fire. She adjusted the mic, hands steady, and began. Her words, "I stepped down to protect Alaska from distraction, from dysfunction," sounded rehearsed, almost mythic. But across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, silent, eyes narrowed behind a thin wall of documents. She hadn't touched her pen. She hadn't smiled. While others applauded experience, she studied patterns. And beneath her calm was a storm. The truth wasn't just in her folders. It was in the unasked questions Palin thought she'd never have to face again. No one in the room, no one on air, knew what was coming. But Jasmine did. And she wasn't here to reminisce. She was here to reveal. And just as the floor opened, the atmosphere constricted, not with noise, but with the weight of performance. It was no longer a hearing, it was theater. And the star, as the cameras panned and the lights fell gently on the polished wood, was Sarah Palin, walking the aisle like a returning legend, summoned to rewrite her legacy. The right-wing media had primed the moment for days. "A warrior who shattered the establishment," one columnist declared. "The Alaskan Joan of Arc," said another. Even before she spoke, the script was written. She wasn't just a former governor. She was a symbol, a survivor, a saint. The audience wasn't just watching. They were participating in a carefully staged resurrection. She moved with the confidence of someone who had memorized every frame of her myth, hair set, smile exact, posture deliberate. As she reached the witness chair, she paused, a split-second glance to the gallery, the kind only a media-trained instinct can execute. Then sat, adjusted her blazer, and leaned into the microphone. "I stepped down not out of fear," she began, voice smooth, rehearsed, "but out of duty. When leadership becomes a lightning rod, you don't cling to power. You protect the people you serve, even if it costs you everything." Then she added, letting the line land like scripture, "I resigned because I placed the needs of my state above the needs of my own reputation." She blinked slowly, let the words hang like a prayer at a funeral. There was no tremble, no hesitation. Just narrative, tight and invulnerable. A few members clapped, uncertainly at first, then louder. One staffer even stood halfway, glancing around for approval. But across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. No applause, no expression. Just two fingers holding the edge of a folder that hadn't left her grasp since the hearing began. Her eyes didn't track Palin's hands or her smile. They were locked on the gray and white printout tucked in front of her, a document with signatures, timestamps, and metadata that told a very different story. One that had no cameras. One that was never meant to see daylight. In that moment, the room was split, between those captivated by the show and one woman who had come prepared to dismantle it. But beneath the applause and the mythic glow of Palin's statement, something in the air turned, not dramatically, but unmistakably. It was the kind of shift only a few could sense, a drop in temperature, a hush behind the breathless cameras. And in that hush, Jasmine Crockett moved, Not suddenly, not theatrically. Just a small tap on her console. The chamber's giant digital display, until now dim, burst to life in a cold, clinical blue. A graph appeared, line by line, point by point, tracing Alaska's unemployment rate across 8 quarters. The timeline pulsed, before Palin's resignation and after, and then it spiked. Increased 12%, not a suggestion, not an opinion. A documented rupture, too sharp to ignore. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. Her gaze stayed locked on Palin. "Let's not romanticize leadership," she said, her voice calm, sharp like polished steel. "Let's examine the impact of absence." She gestured once, and the next slide snapped into place. A detailed state financial map unfolded. $1.2 billion in suspended or eliminated programs, color-coded by region. Yellow meant delayed, red meant canceled. Healthcare in Bethel, gone. A bridge project in Matanuska-Susitna, abandoned. Education funding for native schools, stripped clean. Jasmine let the silence thicken as the room absorbed what they were seeing. Data over drama, fallout over fiction. "These aren't just numbers, Governor," she said, voice low and deliberate. "These are broken grants, shuttered clinics, and phone calls no one returned." Then came the strike, swift, precise, impossible to dodge. "Do you believe that walking away mid-crisis, without warning, without transition, was responsible governance?" No one breathed. The screen kept glowing. The myth had been told. Now came the reckoning. The silence following Jasmine's question hung heavy, like a dropped curtain before an unscripted scene. And in that pause, when all eyes turned to the witness chair and breath seemed suspended between expectation and deflection, Sarah Palin inhaled slowly, visibly steadying herself, as if preparing to bleed onto the microphone. No numbers this time. No graphs. No talking points. What came next was personal, a pivot from policy to pain. Her voice emerged low and strained, carrying the weight of something rehearsed but real. "No one tells you," she said, scanning the faces before her, "what it costs to lead when your every move is targeted. Not because you failed, but because you threatened the wrong people." Her gaze swept across the panel, not accusing, but imploring. "I didn't step down because I was weak. I stepped down because I was being broken, systematically." Her hands clenched together on the desk, knuckles whitening. "In the final year of my governorship, I faced 24 ethics complaints. 24. And not one of them led to a conviction. Not one." She paused. "But they cost me over $500,000 in legal fees. That's more than I ever earned in office." The room didn't move. The camera zoomed in, tight, intrusive, unforgiving. Her eyes welled, and this time she didn't try to stop it. "There were days I couldn't pay my lawyers and still afford groceries," she continued, her voice cracking. "My husband was working overtime on the slope, and we were still drowning, all because I dared to challenge entrenched systems, to take on my own party when I saw corruption." Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned slightly, not away from the room, but into herself, into the memory she was reliving in front of the nation. She reached for a tissue, hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the flood of exhaustion she no longer had the will to hide. "I had 3 children at home. Trig was still a baby. Every morning I had to look them in the eye and pretend everything was okay, that their mother wasn't under siege, that we weren't selling furniture to stay afloat, that I wasn't reading court filings before bedtime stories." Her voice dropped lower, nearly a whisper but still audible to every corner of the chamber. No one came to help. No one stepped in. They just watched. Her next words came slower, as if extracted from somewhere deeper than memory, from guilt, perhaps, or pride in conflict with shame. "Resigning wasn't abandonment. It was survival. It was the only way I could protect the people I loved." Another tear rolled down her cheek, tracing a path over powdered skin and falling soundlessly to the table below. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I was being dismantled, one allegation at a time, one headline at a time, until all that was left of me was a shell fighting ghosts I couldn't afford to exercise." She looked up now, locking eyes with no one and everyone. Her voice steadied again, but only just. If I hadn't resigned, I wouldn't just have lost my title. I would have lost my children, my home, my sanity. That's not politics. That's real life. That's what it cost me to lead. For a moment, just a moment, the chamber softened. Her vulnerability carved a silence more profound than any argument. The audience didn't clap, didn't shift. They simply stared, caught between empathy and disbelief, between the woman who once governed a state and the woman now testifying not as a politician, but as a mother under siege. But beyond the tissue, beyond the tear, and beyond the trembling lip, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not out of cruelty, not out of disbelief, but because she too had seen women like Palin cry on command in documents that told stories their tears never could. And Jasmine knew something the audience didn't yet. Vulnerability without truth is still performance. But for now, Palin had the floor, and her pain filled it. But just as sympathy began to thicken like smoke around Sarah Palin's voice, as the image of a struggling mother began to cement itself in the minds of viewers across the country, Jasmine Crockett struck a match and set the illusion ablaze. No raised voice, no grand gesture, just a single deliberate motion, her index finger tapping the panel beside her. And instantly, the room's massive screen came to life again. Not with charts or unemployment data this time, but with something far more intimate and damning. A contract, the header crisp and unmistakable. HarperCollins Publishers, LLC, exclusive book agreement with Sarah Louise Palin. In the fine print, the number blazed like a flare in a dark tunnel. $7 million advance, payable in 3 installments. The date was impossible to ignore, August 26, 2009. Just 2 months and 2 days after Palin's resignation letter had been delivered to the citizens of Alaska under the banner of sacrifice. The screen shifted again. Another document appeared, this time branded with the golden crest of Discovery Communications. At the top, a production agreement, Sarah Palin's Alaska, TLC television series. And beneath that, in bold, talent fee, $1,250,000 US. Attached to the agreement were schedules, filming locations, and a clause ensuring Palin retained creative control over the project's tone and message. In the background, the still image of Palin fly fishing in crystal-clear Alaskan rivers faded in. Pulled directly from early promotional footage. It wasn't leadership. It wasn't policy. It was marketing. And it was lucrative. Jasmine finally spoke. She didn't look up at the witness stand, not yet. Her eyes remained on the screen as if daring the numbers to refute her. $7 million, she began, her voice low, unwavering. That's the advance you received for your book, a memoir you were already negotiating while you were still in office. She turned the page on her desk, as calm as a surgeon. And here, a contract for a reality television series signed less than 3 months after your resignation. Filmed not in silence, but with full studio crews. Executive produced by you. Marketed with your name, featuring your brand. Then finally she looked up, directly at Palin. Her tone hardened. You stood in this chamber and cried over legal bills. You told the American people you left office to save your family from financial ruin. But these aren't the papers of someone escaping hardship. These are the blueprints of someone capitalizing on celebrity. Palin didn't speak. Her lips parted, then froze. The crowd behind her sat frozen, as if the oxygen had been yanked out of the room. Somewhere near the press pool, a pen dropped and clicked across the floor. It was the only sound. Jasmine leaned back slightly, but her eyes didn't move. This wasn't retreat, she said, each word deliberate. This was a launch. Her hand hovered briefly above the last slide now illuminated behind her, a bar chart showing Palin's total income in the 12 months after her resignation. $12.4 million from book deals, television appearances, and speaking engagements. You didn't step away from politics because you were drowning. You stepped away because it was more profitable to stand on dry land, holding a camera. She waited. The silence after was not a pause. It was a consequence. A moment left raw and untouched. The way only uncomfortable truth can hollow out a room. And then Jasmine delivered the line that shattered what was left of the image Palin had built over the past 30 minutes. You didn't resign because you were poor. You resigned to become a millionaire on TV. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The words were louder than any accusation, colder than any statistic. They didn't need a reaction. They were the reaction. In that moment, the narrative shifted, not just in the chamber, but across every home, office, and an airport bar tuned into the broadcast. And as the screen behind Jasmine dimmed to black, it no longer cast light on Palin. It cast shadow. The final syllable of Jasmine Crockett's sentence still hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving, when the spell of silence was broken, not by applause, not by rebuttal, but by intervention. A Republican senator seated 3 chairs from the center leaned forward abruptly, as if jolted by instinct rather than strategy. His voice, though measured, trembled faintly with indignation. "Madam Chair," he called out, his eyes darting toward Jasmine before settling on the dais. "With all due respect, I must object. Congresswoman Crockett is crossing a line. This chamber demands a degree of decorum. That was not a question. That was a personal insult. I ask that she show proper respect to our guest. Governor Palin deserves that much." The words landed with the brittle formality of someone reaching for control in a room already overtaken by truth. The tension didn't ease. It coiled tighter, as if the air itself refused to move forward until justice had finished speaking. Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She didn't even raise her voice. Her stillness was louder than any rebuttal. Her silence, deliberate and precise, served as its own indictment of systems that protect reputations over facts, appearances over impact. Before she could speak, the chairwoman raised one hand, palm down, and issued her ruling in a voice that silenced every whisper in the chamber. "Congresswoman Crockett will continue," she said firmly. "This is an oversight hearing. And oversight is meaningless without accountability." The ruling echoed through the hall like the toll of a bell. Final, unshakable. There would be no rescue. Not today, not here. The camera crew, sensing the pivot, shifted lenses with cinematic instinct. The primary broadcast feed cut sharply to a close-up of Sarah Palin's face, and for the first time since the hearing began, the veneer showed strain. Her lips, once steady and pressed into confident lines, now pulled tight across her teeth. Her eyes flickered, not with outrage, but with something far more revealing, doubt. Her jaw tensed, a muscle twitch betraying the effort to hold composure. She blinked twice, fast, deliberate, stalling. The kind of blink a person makes when recalibrating a strategy mid-collapse. The tears from earlier had dried, but in their place was something colder, rawer. The realization that the story she came here to tell had met a sharper, harder version of the truth. She tried to keep her posture, but the screen behind her had already done its work. The memory of those contracts, those dollar signs, the timeline, it all lingered behind her, like a ghost she couldn't outrun. No one spoke. No one moved. Every angle of her discomfort was caught in high definition, broadcast into living rooms and offices across the country. And as the camera held that frame, tight on the woman once called unstoppable, America saw not collapse, but erosion. Not explosion, but slow, irreversible unraveling. And just as the weight of Jasmine Crockett's last line still echoed across the chamber, a new kind of silence settled. Not awkward, not empty, but dense with anticipation. The kind of stillness that warns something far more damning is coming. The atmosphere, already tense, narrowed into razor focus as Crockett moved with lethal precision, tapping a key on her console. The overhead display blinked once, then illuminated with something that didn't resemble policy or opinion, but evidence, stained with the fingerprints of suppressed truth. The screen displayed a scanned document, worn at the corners, time-stamped, bearing the embossed seal of the Office of the Alaska State Attorney, dated April 7th, 2009. The bold black heading read, "Confidential, Legal Counsel Memorandum," and beneath it, a subject line that sucked the breath from the room before a word was even read. "Potential early exit of Governor Sarah Palin. Legal assessment and emergency considerations." Crockett stood slowly. Her movement wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, like a verdict rising to meet its silence. "What you're looking at," she said, each syllable crisp and measured, "is not a theory, not a partisan blog post, not a media rumor." Her voice cut through the stillness like a scalpel. "This is a confidential legal memo drafted by senior attorneys in the state of Alaska, marked for internal review only, never meant to be seen by the public, and certainly never meant to surface here." She didn't look at Palin. Not yet. The camera panned to the screen as Crockett read aloud, letting the words echo like charges in a courtroom. "Governor Palin is believed to be actively exploring legal avenues for early resignation. Based on corroborated communication patterns and recent inquiries made by her private legal team, there is reasonable basis to conclude the governor is seeking to vacate her office prior to the conclusion of term, without triggering formal impeachment proceedings." The phrase "without triggering formal impeachment" hit like the drop of a gavel. The words weren't speculative. They weren't emotional. They were clinical, prepared by lawyers who'd seen something real and urgent behind the curtain. Palin didn't move, but the tightness in her jaw returned. The light from the screen cast a sterile glow against her cheekbones, and for a fleeting second, she looked less like a leader under fire and more like someone cornered by her own unfinished sentences. Jasmine turned the page on her folder and gestured slightly, prompting the screen to advance. Now, red highlights dominated the screen. A block of text, clearly meant for internal eyes only, was underlined and annotated. Jasmine read slowly. "Given the compounding volume of ethics complaints filed against the governor, currently 19 pending and 5 in pre-investigative review, it is our legal opinion that at least 3 of these filings hold material substance that, if substantiated, could escalate to the level of an impeachment inquiry by the Alaska State Legislature." She paused just long enough for the words to settle like sediment in water. Then calmly she read the most chilling line of all. "Recommendation: prepare contingency protocol in the event of an unannounced resignation." There it was. Stark. Undeniable. A legal body had already begun planning for her escape. Not as a noble act, but as a preemptive strike against accountability. Crockett let the weight of that sentence hover over the room like a thundercloud refusing to break. "Let me be absolutely clear," Jasmine said, now turning her full focus to Palin for the first time since the document appeared. "This memo was drafted before your resignation, weeks before you told the people of Alaska that you were protecting them from distractions, before you stood at a podium and claimed financial hardship, before the cameras, before the book deals, before the show." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. It had authority. It had truth. This wasn't sacrifice, this was strategy. Palin blinked once, slowly, deliberately, but said nothing. Her hands, which had moments earlier been clasped tightly on the table, now shifted minutely, fingers restless. She stared forward, expression caught between disbelief and calculation, as though re-evaluating a chessboard that no longer followed the rules she understood. The room had frozen around her. No one interrupted. Even her defenders sat in motionless silence, their talking points rendered useless in the face of a document no one had expected to see. The memo was not an interpretation. It was an internal admission, and now it was public. Jasmine took a slow breath, letting her next words come like a final blow. "While the public was fed a story of resilience and martyrdom, your own state's legal counsel was preparing for political collapse." Her hand hovered over the screen's final page, where the document concluded with procedural steps for gubernatorial transition, including staff downsizing and crisis communication strategies. Proof that the machinery of exit had already been set in motion, long before Palin ever said a word to the people who elected her. "You didn't walk away from the job," Jasmine said, her voice like stone under pressure. "You planned your exit like a CEO facing indictment and hoped no one would ever see the blueprint." For a few seconds, the room became a vacuum. The lights, the wood panels, the marble pillars, all of it faded behind the thunderous silence that truth always leaves in its wake. The cameras stayed fixed on Palin. Her eyes didn't blink this time. Her mouth twitched slightly, the corners drawn just enough to betray the moment before the mask falls apart. And Jasmine sat back down, slowly, deliberately, as if knowing that there was nothing left to add. The document had already spoken. And its voice was the one thing Palin couldn't rewrite. The final echoes of the internal memo still lingered like smoke in the chamber. Its final line: prepare contingency protocol in the event of an unannounced resignation, humming beneath the surface like a distant alarm. The tension in the room wasn't just ambient now, it was personal. A soft shift in posture, a clenched jaw, a muscle twitch. Signs of a political mass beginning to fracture under pressure. And it was then, in the shadow of that silence, that Sarah Palin chose to speak. She sat up straighter, stiffening her spine as though defiance alone could armor her against what had just been exposed. Her voice, when it came, was brittle but composed, a tone familiar to those who'd seen leaders try to reassert control when the ground was already giving way beneath them. That memo, she began, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, was never officially acknowledged. It was staff chatter, internal speculation. That's not fact, that's fiction dressed up in a letterhead. She paused, glancing at the panel, her tone growing sharper. Let's be clear. I have never been impeached. I've never even been formally investigated. That word, impeachment, never touched my name in any official capacity. Her voice tightened as she delivered what she clearly thought would be the killing stroke. That was a rumor. I was never under threat of impeachment. A murmur stirred faintly from the gallery, not loud but perceptible, the kind of sound that fills a room when truth and spin collide, and no one's sure who will survive the impact. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She didn't blink. She let the defense sit there, untouched, just long enough to ferment in its own false confidence. Then, with a slow inhale and voice sharp as frost, she replied, not with fire but with devastating restraint. No one said you were impeached, Governor. She leaned slightly forward, hands still calm atop the folder that had slowly peeled back the layers of Palin's narrative. We said the legal counsel for your state believed, based on internal communications, third-party briefings, and your own movements, that if those complaints advanced, they would have had no choice but to prepare for it. Another pause. Intentional, surgical. We said they were preparing for the fallout of a resignation that wasn't noble, but necessary. Palin's face froze. Not the practiced stillness of political theater, but the rigid pause of someone realizing they've miscalculated the battlefield. The defense she had prepared was aimed at an accusation no one had made, but Jasmine wasn't accusing her of being impeached. Jasmine was accusing her of something far worse, evading justice before it had the chance to knock. And that, Jasmine added quietly, almost like an afterthought, isn't gossip. That's governance, terrified of where the facts were leading. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need another document, because the courtroom wasn't in the pages anymore. It was in the silence that followed. And in that silence, Palin's narrative, built over a decade of memoirs, interviews, and image control, began to unravel at the seams. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet, tearing sound that only truth can make. The reverberations of Jasmine's last blow, terrified of where the facts were leading, still lingered in the chamber air like static. But before anyone could recover, a new name was called, and the silence hardened into stillness. It was the kind of quiet not born of respect, but of dread, the sound of a room bracing for revelation. All rise for witness Michael Wexler, the chairwoman announced. The name carried weight, not with the public perhaps, but with everyone who knew the machinery of Alaska's executive office. Wexler had served as a senior legal advisor inside Palin's administration during the volatile final year of her term. A man who never courted the cameras, a man who didn't leak, but also a man who, by his mere appearance, signaled that something buried deep was about to be unearthed. He walked slowly to the witness seat, his face unreadable, the lines of age and conflict etched deep along his brow. He wore a plain gray suit, no pin, no flourish, just the appearance of someone who had kept secrets for long enough. As he raised his right hand to be sworn in, even the cameras held back. This wasn't spectacle anymore. This was a reckoning. He sat, adjusted the mic with practiced caution, then spoke with a voice that was neither loud nor theatrical, but hauntingly precise. During the final quarter of Governor Palin's administration, Wexler began, I was tasked with reviewing and facilitating a number of private legal requests filed by senior members of the governor's staff. He looked up briefly, meeting no one's eyes. Among those requests were two confidential outreach efforts, one to a Los Angeles-based firm that specialized in entertainment law, particularly reality television development, the other to a New York firm that negotiated large-scale nonfiction publishing deals. There was no gasp, no outcry, just a collective, breathless pause, as if the entire room understood the meaning before the witness had even finished. These consultations, he continued, his voice tightening slightly, were initiated several weeks before Governor Palin made any formal announcement, even before she scheduled the press conference. He reached into the folder before him and tapped a dated summary. In both cases, the objective was clear: to evaluate the scope and structure of potential media opportunities, specifically a televised docuseries and a memoir with national release projection, pending her resignation. The chamber froze. No one needed a follow-up. The implication wasn't subtle, it was surgical. The governor had been planning her exit not as a retreat from political persecution, but as a calculated pivot to personal profit. Jasmine hadn't simply poked holes in Palin's story. Wexler had just ripped out the foundation and held it up to the light. He sat still, unmoved by the tension folding in around him. At no point were these communications made public. At no point were they disclosed to the legislature, the media, or the citizens of Alaska. He cleared his throat once, softly like brushing dust off a buried file. They were handled through private counsel and routed through unofficial email channels. As far as I know, no minutes exist documenting those discussions in the official state archive. The room didn't breathe. Neither did Palin. Her hands, once neatly folded, now clenched visibly in her lap. Her jaw, which had moved easily when deflecting earlier questions, sat locked, a fortress suddenly without walls. And in that moment, the portrait she had painted, a mother besieged, a leader broken by injustice, fractured at its center. Because now, from the mouth of one of her own, the truth had emerged. She didn't fall. She prepared her landing. And while the chamber held its breath in silence, the outside world exploded. What began as a hearing tucked into the midday schedule of C-SPAN quickly mutated into a national rupture. By the time Michael Wexler stepped down from the witness seat, Chashur Palin resignation, truth had already surged past 2 million tweets in under an hour. The hashtag wasn't just trending, it was dominating, eating the top 5 spots on every U.S. platform. Phones buzzed in congressional staffers' pockets like alarms they couldn't silence. Commentators, influencers, political strategists, left, right, and everything in between, took to their feeds like emergency responders racing to a 5-alarm fire. But this wasn't policy. This wasn't punditry. This was blood in the water. One viral clip led the digital wave, a tight shot of Jasmine Crockett's calm, unsparing delivery. You didn't fall. You prepared your landing. Paired with the screen behind her, glowing with Palin's publishing contract and the internal state memo, it spread like a confession captured on hidden tape. Millions of viewers hit retweet without even watching the rest of the footage. They didn't need to. The image was enough. One woman standing, another unraveling, and the illusion of political martyrdom coming apart at the seams. Cable news networks scrambled. CNN broke into a scheduled interview with a Fortune 500 CEO mid-sentence, replacing his talking points with a live feed from the hearing. MSNBC dropped its economic panel on inflation within seconds of Wexler's testimony. Even Fox News, usually cautious to defend one of the GOP's original populist icons, began framing the coverage in language laced with distance, new scrutiny, unconfirmed revelations, narratives in collapse. But language wasn't needed. The video clips did the work. The image of Sarah Palin stiff in her chair, blinking into silence as documents surfaced against her, spoke with a clarity no anchor could match. Within 30 minutes, ABC, CBS, and NBC all cut into afternoon programming, bouncing soaps and courtroom dramas for the one real courtroom that now had America hooked. Even syndicated talk shows, pre-recorded, pre-scheduled, were pushed aside. One Chiron on CBS read in all caps, "Hearing or History." Beneath it, a live feed of Jasmine flipping through a folder as if she were turning the pages of a country's political memory. In coffee shops across the country, people huddled over phones and tablets. In airports, gate TVs saw flights delayed as passengers refused to board mid-broadcast. In newsrooms, legal teams were called in early, not to vet coverage but to brace for the flood. By 2:37 p.m., 5 major publishing houses had issued official, no-comment statements in response to requests about Palin's book deal. HarperCollins, who had offered her the $7 million advance, went dark. Their website crashed under the sudden traffic surge, and journalists began digging into every contract clause, every NDA, every production agreement linked to Sarah Palin's Alaska. Outside the Capitol, a crowd was forming, fast. Word had spread like wildfire that the hearing wasn't just exposing the story of one resignation, but pulling back the curtain on an entire era of myth-making. Some held handwritten signs that read "Truth over Theater." Others brought printed screenshots of the memo Jasmine had revealed, hoisting it like a relic of civic betrayal. The lawn was swelling with reporters, protesters, and stunned tourists who stumbled upon history being rewritten in real time. Inside Twitter headquarters, a server engineer reported the platform had spiked to election night levels of velocity. Hashtag threads weren't just exploding with rage or celebration. They were crawling with lawyers, ethics experts, even former state employees anonymously leaking context beneath the primary posts. One former legislative aide tweeted a damning thread outlining how the ethics complaints had been buried under procedural delay until Palin's resignation disarmed them. That thread alone gained 300,000 likes in less than 15 minutes. It was no longer just a trend. It was a reckoning with the past, forced to the surface under Klieg lights in a streaming feed. Political think tanks began issuing emergency bulletins. The Heritage Foundation called for a pause in politicized commentary while the hearing unfolded. Code for "This is worse than expected." The Lincoln Project, in contrast, issued a 4-word blast. "We told you so." Capitol Security added 2 more rows of officers outside the hearing room. Not for immediate threat, but in anticipation of a wave of media crews now trying to force physical access. Journalists who'd covered mid-level committee hearings for years suddenly found themselves surrounded by camera trucks and credentialed anchors. Every hallway seemed to buzz with whispered versions of the same thing. "Did you hear what Wexler said? She had the contract before she resigned? Do they have emails? Is this going to force a federal review?" And above all the noise, one label began to crystallize. On social media, on op-eds being written mid-broadcast, on handwritten notes passed between producers and talking heads. A public trial of conscience. The phrase was first coined by a Yale constitutional law professor during a live Skype interview on MSNBC. "This isn't technically a criminal hearing," he said, adjusting his earpiece. "But make no mistake, what you're seeing is the function of democracy at its highest tension point. A trial of truth, televised, a moral reckoning." Within minutes, the term had gone viral. TikTokers began remixing the phrase into digital montages. Clips of Jasmine laying out documents over pounding music. Cuts of Palin blinking under camera glare. Quotes scrolling across the screen like a drumbeat. This is a trial of conscience. By 3:20 p.m., the Associated Press officially revised its headline from "Oversight Committee Holds Ethics Discussion" to "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett Sparks National Firestorm with Palin Resignation Evidence." Editorial desks across the country issued the same marching order. Drop everything. Run this on page 1. Somewhere deep in the political machinery of the Republican Party, panic had begun to bloom. Anonymous GOP aides, speaking off the record to Politico, admitted that what had begun as a legacy polishing appearance had gone nuclear. Donations were paused. PR teams were called off lunch breaks. Palin's legal representatives, when contacted for comment, issued only a single-sentence reply. "Governor Palin stands by her record of service and will address these distortions in due time." But it was too late, because the court of public opinion was already in session. And this wasn't a trial of legal guilt. It was something deeper, more dangerous. This was a trial about truth, and everyone was watching. No verdict had been issued, no formal charges filed. But in living rooms across America, people were no longer talking about Sarah Palin as a public servant. They were talking about Sarah Palin as a brand that in Jasmine Crockett's hands had just been peeled open like a press kit turned inside out. And for the first time in years, Palin didn't control the story. The story controlled her. And just as the weight of public judgment reached its apex, the inevitable crack finally split through the chamber. For hours, Sarah Palin had absorbed the pressure with a veteran's grit, jaw tightened, smile buried beneath restraint, posture coiled in defiance. But no myth, no matter how rehearsed, could survive this much exposure. Not when hashtags detonated across the country. Not when every camera caught the flinch behind her eyes. Not when every document peeled back another layer of carefully constructed narrative. The room was still, unbearably so. Witnesses had stopped whispering. Lawmakers had stopped flipping through their folders. Even the staffers' fingers hovered above keyboards, paralyzed mid-keystroke. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, back straight, face unreadable, watching not just a witness, but an empire made of television lights and talking points begin to combust in real time. And that's when it happened. Sarah Palin stood up, not subtly, not cautiously, but with the kinetic jolt of someone who had been pushed too close to the fire and finally decided to run straight into it. Her chair scraped loudly across the floor, its legs screaming across marble like a warning shot. She didn't wait to be acknowledged. She didn't ask to be recognized. She didn't care. Her voice sliced into the chamber like a flare, emotional, furious, and trembling on the edge of unraveling. "This," she said, eyes blazing as she gestured toward the panel, the screen, the documents stacked like weapons before her. "This is a coordinated attack, a political ambush, a disgrace." Her hands shook as she pointed toward Jasmine. "I came here to speak on public service. I came here in good faith. But I will not sit here and be insulted, accused, dissected, humiliated on national television." She inhaled sharply, her chest visibly rising with the effort to regain control, but the heat in her words only escalated. "This isn't oversight, it's vengeance. It's political theater, designed not to seek truth, but to destroy reputations. My reputation." Her voice cracked at the edge, and for the first time her anger sounded like desperation dressed as outrage. "And I won't be part of it. I won't sit here and be treated like a criminal for serving my state." The chamber had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that comes after a detonation, not because nothing has happened, but because everything has. And then, with surgical stillness, Jasmine Crockett rose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply stood, elegantly, precisely, like a blade sliding free of its sheath, and met Palin's glare with unflinching calm. Their eyes locked across the table, across the cables and microphones, across the shattered mythology and the mounting evidence. And when Jasmine spoke, it wasn't a rebuttal. It was a scalpel. "You call this an attack, Governor?" Her voice was steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that makes everyone lean in without realizing they've stopped breathing. "You call this humiliation?" She took a single step forward, the weight of her presence filling the space between them like a closing door. "You say you came here in good faith, but the truth came here with evidence." Now her voice sharpened, not louder, but more exact, every syllable fired like a round of cold steel. "You sat here while the nation watched documents with your signature, emails, contracts, memos from your own state's legal office, all laid bare." She paused just long enough to let the silence ripple like thunder on the horizon. "And now you call the facts insults?" Jasmine leaned in, not physically but vocally, her tone dropping into a blade-thin register. "So tell me, Governor, do you consider the truth to be a form of disrespect?" The room didn't erupt. It imploded. Emotion didn't pour out. It froze in place, encased in tension too thick to cut. Palin stood still, her mouth parted just slightly. The retort she had clearly prepared caught somewhere between her breath and her pride. But the moment she had seized, standing up, declaring war, accusing the process of betrayal, had already been stolen by the weight of those final words. "Do you consider the truth to be a form of disrespect?" It was not a question. It was a verdict. One carved into silence, aired live to the country, stamped onto every social media feed with captions that burned. The cameras captured it all. Jasmine's gaze clear and calm as iron, Palin's eyes wide but hollow, as though realizing too late that she had overplayed a defense against something that could not be spun, evaded, or shouted down. Not anymore. And as the moment stretched on, the chamber took on the aura of something no longer political, no longer procedural, but spiritual. This was no longer a debate between two women. It was a national exorcism of pretense, a confrontation between legacy and accountability, myth and memory. Then came the sound of a single camera flash, then another, and another. Reporters were already composing headlines in their minds. Palin explodes, Crockett eviscerates. Truth isn't an insult. Congresswoman's line shakes hearing to its core. But Jasmine wasn't thinking about headlines. She was thinking about the millions watching, the young woman in Alaska who once believed in a leader, the civil servant who kept showing up while her governor disappeared into book deals and production trailers. She was thinking about truth, the kind too often dismissed as anger, too often called impolite when spoken by women who refused to bow. She didn't sit. She let the silence stretch one moment longer. Let Palin stand there, shaking with anger that no longer had anywhere to go. And she added, softer this time, but even more lethal. If facts feel like an attack, maybe the problem isn't the facts. That was it. The hearing hadn't adjourned. No gavel had dropped. But the battle, that moment of public collision between narrative and evidence, defiance and accountability, was over. And the room, the country, and history itself knew exactly who had walked out of it with the truth on her side. And after the firestorm, the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention, but demands judgment. Sarah Palin was still standing, lips parted, fists clenched, but motionless, caught in the center of her own unraveling. Her final protest now floated like ash in the air, smoldering but powerless. The room had not moved. Neither had the millions watching at home. The cameras remained locked, the microphones hot, the nation suspended in a moment too full to breathe. And that's when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward. No chaos, no dramatic overture. Just a single step, and with it, the weight of every word she was about to deliver. Her heels echoed across the chamber floor with a deliberate, measured cadence. She didn't need volume to command the room. The air had already bent toward her, every lens followed, every back straightened. She was not stepping into position, she was stepping into history. In her left hand, she held the folder, the same one that had contained every contract, every memo, every page of redacted strategy that had exposed the core of Palin's exit for what it was. In her right, she held nothing at all, because the truth needs no props. It only needs a voice. She paused just before the microphone, let the weight of her stillness pierce through every screen, then lifted her eyes. The entire room leaned in, not forward, but inward, toward the space where fiction had just collapsed and truth now waited to speak. Her voice, when it came, was steady, not righteous, not angry, just clear, like a verdict being read by someone who had seen this coming long before the crowd ever did. Leadership is not about standing in front of cameras. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe between lines. She simply delivered them, with the cadence of conviction, not performance. Leadership is staying when everything around you is falling apart. A pause, just enough to let the truth reverberate. Just enough to let every viewer at home remember the faces of the nurses laid off in Alaska. The roads never paved. The community programs that had gone dark when their governor walked away without warning. And you, she turned slightly toward Palin now, but didn't raise her tone. You didn't stay. You didn't fight. You left. Her fingers tapped once against the folder. No need to open it again. Everyone already knew what was inside. The nation had seen it. You left not to protect the people, not to spare them chaos, not because you had to. A beat. You left for profit. The last word didn't land like a hammer. It landed like a scalpel. Precise, cold, undeniable. She didn't inflect it with scorn. She let it carry its own gravity, because by now the numbers had already spoken. The $7 million book deal, the $1.25 million TV show, the timeline that connected resignation to revenue like dots on a map. Then she stepped back from the mic, just 1 inch, and let the silence consume the chamber once more. But it wasn't empty now. It was alive with consequence. No one applauded. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't dare. No camera clicked. Not a single lens shuddered. The silence was total. The kind of silence that doesn't ask a question, it answers one. It renders judgment. It is the sound of a myth collapsing in real time. Somewhere in the back, a staffer dropped a pen, and it rolled across the marble with an almost surreal clarity. Every head turned. Even that sound felt loud. Palin did not speak. She had no rebuttal prepared for that. Because what do you say when the accusation is not political, not personal, but moral? When the nation no longer sees you as the victim, but as the architect of your own fall? Jasmine remained still, eyes fixed, breath even, posture straight. She didn't gloat. She didn't flinch. Because this was never about destroying a woman. It was about confronting a lie. And now that lie lay exposed beneath the lights of the Capitol, burned into the collective consciousness of a country that had followed Palin's rise, swallowed her narrative, and now stood face to face with the receipts. The folder in Jasmine's hand dipped slightly, like the closing of a book after its final chapter. But no one moved, because it wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of truth, finally spoken without apology. And when the silence finally ended, it did not fade. It detonated. By morning, the nation hadn't moved on. It had awakened into a different political reality. The images from the hearing, looped endlessly across every major news network, had become something more than footage. They had become symbol. Jasmine Crockett standing tall, folder in hand. Palin frozen mid-sentence, her legacy hanging like cracked glass. No spin room could reverse the damage now. The truth wasn't a story anymore. It was a verdict. Inside Palin's camp, panic hit like a second storm. Her morning press tour, a full slate of interviews scheduled with Fox and Friends, Newsmax, The Daily Wire, and a pre-taped sit-down with a major national magazine, was obliterated before sunrise. At 7:04 a.m., her communications director issued a terse statement. In light of yesterday's events, Governor Palin will be pausing all media appearances until further notice. No further comment, no clarification, no fight, just silence. And the media pounced. By 8 a.m., the headlines had gone fully scorched earth. The Washington Post ran with, "The day the spotlight shattered, Palin silenced after Crockett's devastating exposure." The New York Times was sharper, colder, more surgical. Jasmine Crockett dismantles the Palin myth, live in without mercy. Politico didn't mince words. This wasn't a hearing. It was a political autopsy. But it was the Atlantic that delivered the line destined for textbooks. Jasmine Crockett didn't debate Sarah Palin. She ended the era she created. Online, the reaction was apocalyptic. In under 12 hours, over 20 million people had viewed the clip of Jasmine's closing line, reposted by news accounts, celebrities, historians, and even former Republican staffers. Influencers across TikTok and Instagram had cut it into music-backed montages, slow zooms on Palin's stunned expression, overlaid with Jasmine's now iconic line. "You didn't leave for the people. You left for the payout." Hashtags surged again. Crockett truth, Palin exit exposed, and leadership is staying trended simultaneously. Twitter servers flagged a national spike alert, a feature typically reserved for election nights or major Supreme Court rulings. This wasn't just trending. It was engraving itself onto the political consciousness. Cable networks doubled down. MSNBC cleared their entire 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. block, replaying the full testimony in prime time with no commercial breaks. CNN's panel called the moment the political equivalent of a controlled demolition. Even Fox News, Palin's usual stronghold, could no longer shield her under talking points. One host, visibly pale, offered, "This is not the Sarah Palin our viewers remember." By midday, polling firms launched emergency overnight surveys to measure the damage. The results, when they hit, were seismic. 85% of registered voters, including 61% of self-identified conservatives, stated that they now believe Palin had resigned for personal or financial reasons, not public service. The number was even higher, 92%, among voters under 40. That wasn't erosion, that was collapse. In a coordinated flood of front pages, newspapers from coast to coast echoed the same consensus. USA Today led with a single black and white still. Jasmine's back turned toward the cameras, walking away from the witness stand, the headline stamped beneath it like a funeral bell. She spoke. We listened. In Alaska, the fallout was nuclear. Local news stations that had once elevated Palin as a hometown hero now opened broadcasts with apology segments. KTVA Anchorage ran an 8-minute special re-examining the last 6 months of Palin's governorship. Now armed with the documents revealed by Crockett. We knew she left, the anchor said somberly, but we didn't understand why. Now we do. Calls flooded in to the Alaska State Ethics Board. Demands for a retroactive audit. Letters to the editor flooded small-town papers. Even former campaign donors, once proud to be associated with her name, scrambled to distance themselves from what was quickly becoming a cautionary tale of self-serving ambition masquerading as sacrifice. Back in Washington, reporters swarmed outside Palin's temporary residence. No sign of her emerged. Curtains drawn, lights off. The woman who once dominated rallies, book tours, and cable interviews had gone silent. Voluntarily, or perhaps by force of consequence. And inside political strategy rooms across the Capitol, the lesson was sinking in. Truth, when presented without apology, without distraction, could still burn everything down. Not with fury, but with precision. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett refused interviews. She declined all invitations to appear on evening shows or join celebratory panels. Her staff issued a single tweet from her account. 12 words that now live etched into history books and political timelines alike. Leadership is staying when it's hard. That's all I came to say. It was retweeted 1.4 million times in under 6 hours, because it wasn't just a quote anymore. It was a line drawn in the sand, a new standard, a rebuke to every hollow speech, every well-lit resignation, every press conference designed to distract from what was left undone. By nightfall, Americans weren't just talking about what had happened. They were asking who would be next. But in this moment, the silence that had begun in that Capitol chamber had echoed outward, across every newsroom, phone screen, dinner table, and headline, not as an absence of noise, but as a nation holding its breath at the sight of one legacy falling, and the truth rising to take its place. And when the applause never came, when even the cameras hesitated to move, a strange thing happened. The silence became holy. Not in the sacred sense, but in the way a battlefield becomes hallowed after the smoke clears. When the living realize something irreversible has occurred. The air in the chamber wasn't just still, it was stunned. Not because someone had shouted, not because someone had fallen, but because someone had finally told the truth, and nothing happened to stop her. That was the lesson, and it wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the trending hashtags or the looping clips of Jasmine Crockett's voice delivering those final words. You didn't leave for the people, you left for the payout. The true impact lay beneath the surface in what her presence symbolized. It was about the cost of being right before the world is ready to admit it. Because truth tellers are not born, they're built. And they are built slowly, painfully, forged in rooms where they are spoken over, dismissed, tolerated only when silent, and celebrated only when obedient. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand in that hearing as a rising star. She stood there as a survivor of every closed door, every mic cut short, every headline that failed to name what it really was. This wasn't just political theater, it was emotional excavation. And the reason her words hit so hard, so deeply, wasn't just because they exposed a lie. It was because they exposed how long that lie had been allowed to breathe. How many people had known, suspected, looked the other way. How many benefited, how many shrugged, and how often women like Jasmine are told to wait their turn, to let the lie retire on its own terms. But Jasmine didn't wait, because silence for her had never been neutral. It had always been a weight, a compromise, a slow erasure. And on that day, she made the choice, not just to speak, but to speak when it mattered most. When the story was already written, the cameras already framed, the headlines preloaded with spin. She walked into a room built to defend legacy and tore through it with documentation and steel-eyed calm. She knew what they would call her, they always do. Aggressive, disrespectful, too much, but she came anyway. And what she brought with her wasn't anger. It was accumulation. Years of watching people in power rewrite the record. Years of watching accountability defined by who could afford to escape it. Years of watching women, especially women who look like her, forced to hold the weight of truth in whispers because the world doesn't listen until they bleed to be heard. That was the real story beneath the broadcast. Not that Sarah Palin was exposed, but that the machinery of America's political memory was forced, at least once, to stop and listen to the voice it had been trained to overlook. Jasmine's presence shattered more than Palin's narrative. It shattered the belief that truth must come wrapped in politeness to be respected. It shattered the false peace we mistake for unity. And it shattered the notion that leadership is a performance, not a responsibility. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She didn't lecture. She laid out receipts. She laid out patterns. She laid out consequences. And when the smoke cleared, she didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't claim victory. Because this wasn't a win. It was a wound finally exposed to air. The injustice she faced wasn't just systemic. It was personal. Every line she spoke had to be perfect. Every document vetted. Every pause intentional. Because one misplaced breath and the room would have turned. One wrong word and her credibility would have been set on fire. But she didn't misstep. She didn't flinch. Because she knew what was at stake wasn't her image, but the idea that truth itself could still stand up in a room full of denial and not be buried alive. That is the human cost behind what millions called iconic. Behind the memes, the standing ovations online, the op-eds hailing her as the new face of moral courage. Those things came after. But during, she stood alone. She stood knowing that power would try to punish her for exposing its theater. She stood knowing that the backlash wouldn't just be loud, it would be targeted. And she stood knowing that for every headline applauding her today, there would be voices tomorrow questioning her tone, her timing, her motives. But she did it anyway, because someone had to say it. Someone had to say that leadership isn't about cameras, that walking away in a storm isn't noble when the storm was created to avoid accountability. That being first means nothing if it ends in betrayal. That America does not need more stories, it needs more truth. The real moral of that hearing, the one no Chiron could summarize, was that truth, when told plainly, has the power to eclipse every illusion. It doesn't always come with applause. Often it comes with silence, a silence thick with shame, a silence that is, in itself, a confession. And Jasmine Crockett carried that silence like armor. She gave the country a gift it didn't ask for, the discomfort of clarity, and in return she asked for nothing. No book deal, no cable contract, no parade. She walked out the way she came in, with a folder in hand and a spine unshaken. The real lesson wasn't about Palin. It wasn't even about resignation. It was about what it means to hold the line when no one wants it held, to stay when others leave, to speak when truth becomes dangerous, and to do it anyway, because it's right, not because it's easy. That's what Jasmine taught the world. That's what will outlast the headlines. That's what history will remember, not just the moment she stood, but what she stood for. The echo of Jasmine's final words had barely faded when the nation began to reflect, not just on Sarah Palin's unraveling narrative, but on the deeper, more uncomfortable truths it revealed about power, accountability, and the cost of telling the truth. The tension didn't evaporate, it settled into something more enduring, reckoning. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but the weight of what had been said lingered in every hallway, every news segment, every family dinner where someone whispered, "Did you see what she did?" And for all the noise that politics usually makes, this time It was the silence afterward that delivered the loudest message. Jasmine never set out to humiliate anyone. What she exposed was bigger than a single figure. She had confronted an entire culture that rewards charm over character, escape over endurance, storytelling over service. And in doing so, she reminded a fractured nation that leadership isn't about image, it's about sacrifice. She reminded everyone watching that truth is often quiet, lonely, and dangerous. That speaking up, especially when it's inconvenient, is the highest form of public service. And that courage isn't found in applause, but in choosing to stay seated when you're expected to walk away. For millions watching, the lesson wasn't political, it was deeply human. No legacy is untouchable, and no lie, no matter how elegantly dressed, can survive the weight of truth, told plainly. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.